Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. This is my discussion of the second part of The Sleepwalkers by Hermann Broch, or Broch, I'm not sure which, I'll call it Broch in this video, which was published in 1930. The second part is called The Anarchist. The first part was The Romantic. The Romantic was actually the very first book I reviewed on this channel, or discussed on this channel, back in January. So I wore this shirt. I'll throw a link to that in the description. People can go laugh at my first attempt and then take a look at this, my 70th attempt, and see if I've improved at all. This is a modernist novel. It's published in 1930. Broch was born and raised in Austria, but wrote in the German language. When this book was published, Austria was its own nation in 1938 after the Anarchist. Broch was briefly imprisoned. He was born Jewish. His parents were Jewish. He later converted to Catholicism, but he was not, ostensibly he was arrested because he had a socialist pamphlet or tract that he was in possession of, and that actually runs through in this book. There's a number of characters who are socialists. There's like a socialist newspaper that's going on there in Cologne, which is kind of the setting that this book is set along the Rhine River and the industrial towns of the German Empire. It's 15 years after the Romantic, which took place mostly on the Eastern Prussia, and dealt almost exclusively with the upper echelon of the First German Empire. It's sort of at its apex, both militarily. It's won a number of wars in Central Europe and consolidated its power in Central Europe. Economically, it is really growing. It's going to become a dominant economic power in Europe and in the Romantic. And so we sort of see like the upper class, the military focus of that society. Now we're in very much middle class, lower middle class, and an industrial urban society. Now, there's one character who's a holdover between the books, and he is quite important in both books. It's Bertrand, who was sort of the Mephistopheles almost of the Romantic, and now pops up in a very different role. And I'll just be honest and say I didn't particularly enjoy this, certainly not nearly as much as the Romantic. It was not Broch's writing. I thought Broch's writing was solid and interesting in a number of ways. It was primarily the central character, August Esch, that I couldn't stand. I'll briefly discuss a couple of things that I liked within the book, some examples of good writing right here at the start, and then I'm going to kind of go into why I didn't enjoy it. So there's some really good writing. So we have a larger cast of characters in The Anarchist than we did in the Romantic. The Romantic, it was von Passenau, his brother, his friend Bertrand, a woman who's sort of his mistress while he's in the military, the woman who's sort of the next door neighbor who he's supposed to marry, or his brother is supposed to, one of the von Passenaus is supposed to marry, and then his parents. And that's pretty much the entire cast. This one, it's industrial. We have a whole group of people. And there's also a different theme. The theme of Sleepwalkers is the idea that throughout this 20-30 year period, the social structure of the German Empire decays and culminates in it falling apart, losing World War I, falling apart after World War I. This book was written in the late 1920s, published in 1930s, so the Nazis have not risen to power, but there's an undercurrent within this where you can see some tension. I don't think Broch prophesized the rise of the horrifying reality that was the Nazis, but he certainly recognized that there were problems way back, like earlier in this generation, that are now hatching. But there's some really good writing. So one of the characters has this really beautiful statement on love. Love is a matter of distance. Here are two people, and each is on a separate star, and neither can know anything of the other. And then suddenly distance is annihilated, and time is annihilated, and they have flown together, so that they have no separate awareness of each other, or of themselves, and feel no need of it. That is love. And it's weird, like if you've ever been in love, there's that sense of like you have the before and after. You have the idea of like coincidence. Like what does it take for me to go to the university I chose to go to, and for my wife to come from Chicago all the way to a university here in Arizona where we end up meeting and then to be assigned different jobs in the same dorm building at that university, so that we end up interacting with each other and meeting. Like there's all these coincidences that sort of just like come together at this one singularity, and then you can't imagine a world where that doesn't happen, yet what are the odds type thing. So I thought that was a very beautiful statement, and it's even more significant with the character who Broch gives those words to, and I'll mention that later. Another one, it kind of is more in the theme. No one can see another in the darkness, Esch, and that cloudless clarity of yours is only a dream. You know that I cannot keep you beside me, much as you fear your loneliness. We are a lost generation. I, too, can only go about my business. And this idea of this dread or this tragedy that we're being prepared for. And Broch sees, of course, the Great War as this great European tragedy. We know, 90 years on, that something far more horrifying is about to happen. Not even 10 years after this book is published, something far more horrifying is about to happen. But for Broch, the destruction, the wanton and almost mechanical destruction of lives and of society within the Great War, for him is like earth-shattering. And we know that it will become even more, horrifying. But the other piece is Broch has a tendency to have this like authorial consciousness that hovers over the proceedings. So we're mostly in Esch's head, but we get into the heads of a couple of other characters, sometimes for one page, sometimes for 4 pages at a clip. At one point we're in Esch's head, and then we're in the head of a character Erna in her mind, and then Broch impedes as like the narrator and he has sort of that attitude of like the god narrator who's sort of maneuvering everything around, and then he's periodically going to speak to us, the reader, from his consciousness. And so this is an example. He does it across this train trip at one point, where he periodically has this italicized text that's like deeply philosophical, and then he goes on to meditate on this idea of existence and of sleepwalking. And here's what he says. They're like people who have been roused too soon from sleep into freedom, roused to catch the train on time. So their words become more and more uncertain and drowsy, and soon all conversation dies away in an indistinguishable muttering. Their dreams are filled with rage against engineers and demagogues who, strong in the knowledge of infamy, call things by names that are false, so shamelessly false that the angry dreamer must give new and tentative names to everything, yet wistfully yearns that his mother could tell him the true names, and so make the world as secure as a settled home. And I think that's just like such a profound statement on when individuals recognize problems, but they can't even articulate the problem. And we can see that with a child. Like a child will cry and try to explain why he or she is in pain or is frustrated, and so often they don't have the words that they want to use to articulate it. And we think that we get out of that as adults, but we don't. We see that all the time. So I enjoyed those passages. So there's a number of things about this book that I really did enjoy. And then there's Esch, who might have moved into the negative pantheon of my least favorite characters that I've ever interacted with in a book. I mean, I really mean that. He reminds me of Rabbit Angstrom from John Updike, who I regard as like one of the greatest losers and creeps of American literature, of United States literature. He is anti-Semitic. He is misogynistic. He sexually assaults, in my opinion, 2 different characters. Maybe it's some readers might only say it was 1, but he flat out assaults 2 women. He initiates a relationship and then marries one of those, and it's toxic. Like, it's flat out, like the end of the book talks about how he continues to beat her after they get married. He has this messianic complex where he falls in love with a woman in a knife throwing exhibition at a theater, and then wants to like save her, so he creates this. He quits his job as a bookkeeper, which appears to be the only thing he's competent at, and goes and creates this ridiculous female wrestling exhibition where the tights are designed to tear during the show. He's a creep, and he's a loser. He is anti-Semitic. And again, Broch himself is Jewish, so I don't think he's anti-Semitic. He's created this character who I interpret it as, he creates this sort of like everyman who we then see is an everyman monster. There are people who wrap themselves up in their own like egos and their own ideas and how important everything is, and then are just wantonly destructive. He's homophobic. Bertrand, who throughout the Romantic, von Passenau was convinced was trying to either seduce his mistress or the next door neighbor, wealthy next door neighbor that he was supposed to be married to, turns out to be gay. And Bertrand is the one who talks about, we are a lost generation, I can only go about my business. When Esch's friend, who's a socialist, gets thrown in jail for inciting a riot that he doesn't really incite, Esch wants Bertrand to free him. He takes this train to him and he tells everybody, oh, somebody should put Bertrand in jail. Somebody should put that Bertrand in jail. And he finally goes out there because he plans to go kill Bertrand at his estate. So he goes out there, takes the train out there, the 2 nights after he's, assaulted a woman. And he ends up not killing him. But he goes and instead, in his other investigations, had found out that Bertrand's gay. So he sends a letter, an anonymous letter off to the police about, hey, this man engages. And so Bertrand, when confronted with this, ends up taking his own life. That beautiful passage on love comes from a young man who was in love with Bertrand. Like, flat out, the other characters say, like, this man loves Bertrand. And so when Bertrand takes his life, this young man takes his own life as well in grief. And so I think Broch is intentional around, he gives some of the best language, some of the best ideas to characters who are marginalized and destroyed. Their lives are destroyed by Esch, who's supposed to be like he's a Luxemburger, but he's sort of like the German industrialist. So that was really why I didn't like it. Was just, I didn't want to hang out with Esch, and he's the main character of the book. So we're traveling along with an absolutely reprehensible character who makes that journey so unpleasurable. His headspace is not, I want to be, and I kept like fighting against it. And it's a short book, so it only took me a couple of days to read it. But as an example of Esch's misogyny, for 170 pages, we don't know the name of the widow who runs this restaurant / boarding house, primarily a restaurant. He refuses to call her by her first name. Even after he assaults her, even after they start a relationship, even after they basically agree to get married, he never calls her by her first name until we're practically at the end of the book, and then we find out her name's Gertrude. And then he makes a point of he's not going to call her by her name. So Broch, I think, has a lot of merit. The character he's created in August Esch is a monster and not somebody I plan to spend time with. I don't know if I'll feel differently about this book, once I read the final passage, which is set at the end of World War I. But we'll see. It does have a great cover. I don't think Esch is among this crew. But some works that it reminds me of. A little bit of Demons by Dostoevsky, where the idea of how Dostoevsky just absolutely tears into how nonsensically self-important and violent and wishy-washy some of the students, like the revolutionary students who turn out to just be petty and jerks and murder one of their friends. That aspect of Demons came through in the book, so it might be a little more controversial. James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where you have a character who's wildly self-important, ridiculously indulgent, and so Broch almost takes that type of character with Esch and then reveals how hollow all of that is, how destructive all of that is, how dangerous all of that is. There's a number of Virginia Woolf modernist flourishes that I saw in it. It reminded me a little bit of her book Between the Acts. I don't have my copy of that here. The idea of people wanting to exert violence against another level of society kind of reminded me of Murder at the Savoy by Sjöwall and Wahlöö. And then, as I had said, John Updike's Rabbit Engstrom reminded me a lot of August Esch, somebody I don't want to hang out with ever or spend time with. but also Jim Thompson. So Jim Thompson's books that just have these almost like nihilistically destructive characters, and we're in their minds, and it's like I'm not interested in this. And the difference is that I think Broch has something to say, whereas I'm not always sure Jim Thompson had anything to say. So that was The Anarchist from the Sleepwalkers. I do plan to read The Realist at some point, but I don't know when. I'm going to need a massive change of pace for what I do next. Thank you, everyone.